Okay, so we've already talked about water and polar molecules, so I kind of want to continue with that um, in this second part of chemistry. So we're going to go through solutions and solubility, and we're going to focus on water, and then we're going to say something about chemical reactions, especially all of this, like everything that we talk about as it pertains to physiology in the class, and then we'll talk some about acids and bases. Okay, so we had just discussed how water was a polar molecule. Okay, so it's polar. And in case you don't remember, that means that oxygen, hydrogen, hydrogen, that because they don't share electrons evenly, this is a little bit negative and this side is a little bit positive, even though overall it's a neutral molecule. And because one side is negative and one side is positive, they tend to attract each other. And these are hydrogen bonds. Okay, so that's what hydrogen bonds are. And so the hydrogens, which are a little bit positive, like we see here, will line up with the oxygen, which are a little bit negative. Okay? All right, so the other thing that's really important for this class is, and life in general, is that it is a good solvent. Okay, so we hear about water being a good solvent. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that today. All right, so and when we talk about solutions, not to be too confusing here, but a solution, we kind of know what that is. A solution is something that has a solute, which is usually the particle, okay, particle, and it's dissolved in the solvent. Okay, so if something dissolves in in something else, then we call the solution or the fluid part of that the solvent, and the one that's at a lower uh, concentration, we call that the solute. Okay, so it really comes down to concentration. Whatever's a higher concentration, we call that the solvent. Okay, so we're not really concerned about that because when it comes to the human body, almost everything is water-based. Okay, so we're big bags of water with cells floating around in it, and hopefully not floating away, uh, but that's what's going on there. Okay, so when we talk about whether something is soluble, that means that if I were to put a sugar cube or salt, if I were to pour salt, this is supposed to be a salt shaker, into a pan of water, would it dissolve? And we know that the answer is yes, it will dissolve. Now, this is important for physiology because sodium chloride is never sodium chloride inside the body. It is a sodium ion and it is a chloride ion. Okay, sodium chloride is the solid form of that, and you're never going to find solid sodium chloride unless you have some kind of salt crystals that are forming, and then that's usually not a good thing. That's usually something that happens in in the kidneys or in the gallbladder or something like that. So salt crystals are usually not a good thing. Okay, so whether or not something dissolves in water is dependent on whether it is hydrophilic or hydrophobic. Okay, so something that is hydrophilic will dissolve in water, and something that is hydrophobic will not dissolve in water. So that's a big no. Um, if and that we can talk a little bit about hydrophilic, hydrophobic. If something is hydrophilic, this comes back to this little issue here. That's why I stressed this so much before. The fact that you have polarity of water. Okay? If something is hydrophilic, then it must also be polar. Okay? So something that is hydrophilic is polar. Something that is hydrophobic is nonpolar. Okay? So carbon dioxide, which is just kind of shaped like that, is nonpolar. Okay, there is no distribution of charge. There is no positive or negative side. So it's considered nonpolar. And that would not be soluble in water. Okay, things like salts are. Why? Because they are two charged ions that are stuck to each other. Okay, so they're associating with each other because they're charged. However, you put them in water, and that water, the positive side, will pull that chloride away, and the negative side will pull that sodium away. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that. Okay, so I put some definitions up here. In a solution, the solvent dissolves the solute. Substances which contain polar covalent bonds, polar, and dissolve in water are hydrophilic. So that's what I just said. While substances which contain nonpolar bonds, covalent bonds, are hydrophobic, and they do not readily, easily dissolve in water. So this would be things like fats. Okay. Hydrophilic would be things like salts and sugars. Okay, something that has some kind of unequal distribution of charge. Remember I said that polar means an unequal distribution of charge. Okay, so the polarity of water and its bent shape allow it to interact with several neighboring ions or molecules. Water's role as a solvent makes it essential for health and survival. Okay, so I can't stress that enough. So one of the things that is important to understand is if you, again, if we have a little salt shaker here, if we put sodium chloride into water, what happens is the polar water molecules will break it apart. So here's sodium and here's chloride. As soon as you get it into water, this hydrogen, they will just surround it. Okay? And they'll surround that chloride just like this, and they will rip it away from the sodium. Okay? And then you have sodium over here, and the opposite happens, of course. The water, or the oxygen, will also pull the sodium, and this is sodium here. Okay, will pull that sodium away from the chloride. So as soon as the salt gets in there, sodium chloride or whatever kind of salt you're talking about, as soon as it gets in there, it pulls it apart. Now, the same thing happens with sugar. So this shows glucose. Okay, so most sugars, okay, will also do the same thing, because on the sugar, which we'll have another look at that in a second, sugars also have these hydrogen bonds. They can also form hydrogen bonds. They've got the oxygen and the hydrogen, and they're near the surface, and so that oxygen is unfairly keeping the electrons more, just like we saw in water, but that makes sugar a polar molecule. So sugar dissolves in water. And this is the example of glucose. Okay? All right. So hopefully you understand that. Now, there's another thing that we need to understand, and that is this concept of pH. Okay. Now there are a lot of things about pH, and there are a lot of ways to define pH. But really, to make it easy on yourself, um, we're talking about free hydrogen. Okay. So if we have a water molecule, okay, so there's our water molecule. If we have excess hydrogen, so if we put a hydrogen ion in there, let's say we add HCl, what's going to happen is that chloride is going to be pulled away. Okay, so if we add HCl to a solution, we'll say this is in a beaker of some sort. When we add hydrochloric acid to a solution, that chloride is going to be pulled away. Remember, the hydrogen is going to surround it from the water molecules, and it's going to pull that away. What that does is it leaves this hydrogen out here all by itself. Okay? When you leave hydrogen out all by itself, it's just this sort of free floating little thing, and it's going to join up with something. Okay? So it might actually join up with a water molecule and make something called H3O, which is going to have a positive charge. The problem is, and this is why it's so important for the body to regulate pH, is what if you have a protein in here that's doing something, an enzyme or something like that, and that hydrogen joins up with it? All of a sudden, that protein isn't going to work as right as as well. Okay, so we don't want a bunch of extra hydrogen. We don't want to not have enough hydrogen. We want it to be just right. These proteins, everything that your body makes, is made to function at a specific pH range. Okay, so we don't want to have a big fluctuation in pH. We want to keep it homeostasis. Remember, we want to keep it in a nice tight range. Okay, so the important thing here is, so I mentioned acid. The important thing is that if it's below pH below 7, that's acidic. Okay, so pH kind of tends to run a little bit backwards, and that's because it's a logarithmic scale, and and that kind of thing, which you can look into. I'm not going to uh, necessarily make you figure out the logarithm and the calculation for pH. But it's based on, so to the negative 7th to the negative 14th. Okay, so 10 to the negative 14th is a very low number, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So 14 zeros and then a 1. Okay, and I know that's not 14, but whatever, 14 zeros and then a 1. And that's your concentration of free hydrogen. Okay, that's very low, but when you apply it to a logarithm, you end up just taking this number and the pH would be 14. Now, if the pH was, or if the concentration of hydrogen was only 1 times, it was only 10 to the minus 1, that's going to be 1. Okay, 10 to the minus 1 is 1. Okay, so that's a pH of 1. Okay, so you can see if you say what's the higher concentration, well, 1 is a higher concentration than 0.000000 times 14, 1. Okay, so that's a much lower concentration. So that's the reason for it. It does make sense. It is confusing and it throws people off all the time. When you talk about, oh, you're raising the pH, you're thinking, oh, it's raising the acidity. No, if you raise the pH, you actually make it alkaline. Okay, so that's what we would call a base. And then if you make it below a pH of 7, it's acidic. And this is the reason why. It's because of this logarithmic scale. Okay. All right. If it's exactly 7, then that's neutral. And your body usually likes to keep your pH range in about, around 7.2 to 7.4. Okay, so that's where we like our pH to be. So we have buffers, and I'm going to say the buffers that we're going to talk about come up repeatedly throughout the semester when we talk about blood, when we talk about respiration. The blood buffer will come up a lot, and so we're gonna bring that up right now, and then we'll come back to it more again when we cover those sections. Okay, so we have buffers, and buffers moderate a change in pH. Now there are lots of different buffers. Some buffers may work at a pH of 3. Some may work at a pH of 9. The one in our blood likes to keep the pH right around here, around 7.2 to 7.4. Okay. All right, so if we look at this is a nice little visual scale. You can see that here's neutral right here at a pH of 7, and then you can see that as the pH gets lower, okay, then we become more acid. Okay, so it becomes more acidic, and as the pH gets higher, it becomes more basic or more alkaline. Okay. All right, so just remember that. So when you're trying to figure out, the pH of something, whether or not it's acidic or basic, then that's what you think about. Now, the other thing is that we've got this little unit here, and I've mentioned hydrogen, but I haven't mentioned the hydroxide ion, okay, or the hydroxyl group. It's sometimes called that as well when it's bound to something. That comes from the fact that water is H2O, and if you remove this guy, you end up with a free hydrogen, but you also end up with a hydroxide ion. Okay, so when these are exactly the same, well, you have water. Okay, if you have an abundance of hydrogen, it's acidic, but just the opposite, if you have an abundance of OH and there aren't enough hydrogens to make water, you have, it's basic. Okay, so that would be a basic situation. So I mentioned earlier hydrochloric acid. Well, hydrochloric acid is basically donating hydrogen. Okay, there's also something called sodium hydroxide. Sodium hydroxide is basically donating an OH, okay, or hydroxide ion. Okay, so and then the sodium will float away, and the chloride floats away in this case. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so if we have one more, this just kind of goes over um, all of this, and we're going to see things like amino acids. Now, amino acids have this little structure here, a carboxyl group, but you can see it's got at the end of it a hydrogen, and so that means that if it reacts in water or it dissolves, that it's going to release this hydrogen. Okay. Um, a base could do the opposite. So I mentioned sodium, sodium hydroxide, and this is just R group just means whatever, a thing. It's some kind of functional, some kind of group. Um, and so sodium hydroxide, when it reacts, it's going to release, it's going to be sodium plus hydroxide. Okay, so that's going to be a base. Okay, and then that can come back together. If there's a hydrogen sitting out there, it might come back together and it might form water. Okay. Now there are some others. We hear about ammonia or the ammonium ion. And ammonia is different because it's truly more unique. You don't see this very often. Usually it's safe to say that if you see an extra hydrogen sitting on something, that it's an acid. Ammonia is different, so it's always pointed out because NH3 actually, instead of giving up one of its hydrogens, will actually take on a hydrogen to form the ammonium ion. So ammonia and a lot of cleaners are bases, but ammonia is an example of that, and ammonia tends to be, it's a base because it will actually take on an extra. So if I were to put a ammonia right here, well, it might absorb that hydrogen and make an ammonium ion, cation. Okay. All right. So as long as you understand that, I think you'll be okay. All right. So let's talk about chemical reactions. You've probably seen this. I think most of you have had chemistry or you're taking chemistry right now. But you've probably seen this, and there's something very important about this. First of all, remember I just mentioned the blood buffer? This is the major blood buffer. Okay. Now, the reason this is going to come up in respiration is because, look, you have carbon dioxide. You don't want your carbon dioxide levels to build up. Okay. Now, we have usually plenty, well, we always have plenty of water because everything's dissolved in water, so you don't have any shortage of water. But you can see here, as your carbon dioxide levels maybe build up, you get more and more carbon dioxide, it's going to react with more and more water. So we call these first molecules, we call those the reactants. Okay? So these are the reactants, water and carbon dioxide. Those are the reactants. They form a product. In this case, this is a product here. Okay. So when you have a buildup of carbon dioxide and we've got plenty of water, we would say that carbon dioxide is the rate limiter. Um, then as this builds up, it tends to push, and this is the important part. This is the part you need to understand. If we increase the reactants, if this is a reversible reaction, it will push that reaction in this direction. Okay, try to follow this. Okay, so the more, if we're not hyperventilating, hypoventilating, but if we're not getting enough oxygen, and the CO2 starts to build up. CO2 is constantly being produced by the cells, by the mitochondria. We'll see that. So as CO2 builds up more and more and more, it pushes this reaction in this direction. So my question is, this is what you're going to have to understand, is what happens to the pH? So here's this nice simple reaction. This is water plus carbon dioxide. It makes something called carbonic acid. And then this can go on, and that hydrogen can be released to make hydrogen and the carbonate anion. Okay. Okay. So, um, so my question was, what does adding a bunch of carbon dioxide do to the pH? Well, here you have hydrogen. Since we're pushing the reaction this direction, you have a buildup of hydrogen. Well, what's that do to pH? Well, it's going to make it more acidic, because acidic means that there's more hydrogen. What's that do to the pH? Down. Okay, so the pH is going to get lower. Remember, lower means more acidic. Okay, so those are the terms. It's a chemical reaction. The reactants are your starting materials. The products are what ends up. Okay, the substances formed at the end of the reaction. Okay, so so you could say that in this, if you were to break these down into two reactions, this one, so if we just start with this reaction, we could say these are the reactants, this is the product. Now, if we were to, we'll just get rid of all this stuff. If we were to say this is the reaction, and we would say that this is the reactant, these are the products. Okay, if it's going in this direction. However, it's reversible. Okay, so it really depends on which direction this is going. If it's going in this direction, then these are the reactants, and this is the product. Okay, so reversible reactions. Now, because the same thing can happen in the other way. If we hyperventilate, okay, too much oxygen, it'll tend to push this reaction in this direction. Okay, and you end up losing hydrogen, which means that your pH would instead go up. Okay, so it's important to understand that. And right now, just understand this simple fact, and that is if you increase reactants, you drive it in this direction. Okay, so you create more of the product. Okay, if you have a buildup of the product, you're going to slow that, and it's going to maybe move in this direction. Okay, all right. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense, and that's really all that this section is supposed to cover.